Hello. Our four contestants this time come from Scotland in this quarter-final. And they are Michael Kerr, an actuary from Edinburgh, Mrs. Monica Clough, a writer from Dunblane in Perthshire, Robert Cairns, who's a teacher from Edinburgh, and Mrs. Rose Arnold, who's a teacher from New Lanark, Lanarkshire. And so I start with Mr. Kerr, and I ask him, what is the title of Machiavelli's treatise on statecraft and the use of power, which gave rise to the title Machiavellian?
The Prince. The Prince.
It is. What was the name of the so-called father of Europe, the French economist who died in March, aged 90?
Jean Monnet.
Right. Blarney Castle is in which Irish county?
Cork.
It is. The Irish won the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Who did they defeat?
The Danes.
They did. Key West, one-time home of Ernest Hemingway, has become fashionable again after years in limbo. Our fashion correspondent tells us, keeps in close touch. Where is Key West?
Florida.
It is. You scored... Stunning takeoff, marvellous start, because you're going to have to clap again because Mr. Kerr has scored 5 in a row and he gets an extra mark for doing all that. Now, Mrs. Clough, what is the name of the North American road that links Dawson Creek in British Columbia with Fairbanks, 1,500 miles to the northwest?
The Alaskan Highway.
Right. In what island group are Lanzarote, Fuerteventura, and Gomera?
Madeira.
No, Mr. Kerr.
The Canaries.
You're right. And it's Mr. Cairns' go now. What battle is also known as the Battle of the Nations?
The Battle of Leipzig.
Right. How did the flower, the daisy, get its name?
It's from two Old English words meaning the day's eye.
Correct. Who was the author of Sonnets from the Portuguese?
Elizabeth Browning.
She was. Who originated the quantum theory in physics?
Max Planck.
Right for you. Apart from China and Mongolia, can you name 3 of the 4 countries which share a common border with the southern Soviet Union?
Iran, Afghanistan, and North Korea.
You're right, sir. The other one was Turkey. And you, too, I'm delighted to tell you, have scored 5 in a row, and the extra one. This is verily a battle of the Titans. Mrs. Arnold, what are the inhabitants of Monaco called?
Monegasque.
They are. How many noughts are there in the American and the French trillion?
9.
No. Mr. Kerr?
12.
You're right, sir. A million, what we call, or called a billion. The scores are these: 1 to Mrs. Arnold, 1 to Mrs. Clough, 6 to Mr. Cairns, 8 to Mr. Kerr. What is the name, Mr. Kerr, of the detective invented by Peter Sellers in the film The Pink Panther?
Clouseau.
Yes, Inspector Clouseau. Here comes a little bit of music, and I'll ask you a question after you've heard it.
What a day this has been, what a rare mood I'm in. Why, it's almost like being in love. There's a smile on my face for the whole human race. Why, it's almost like being in love. All the music of life seems to be like a bell that is ringing for me. And from the way that I feel when that bell starts to peal, I could swear I was falling. I would swear I was falling.
And the question is, who are the writers of that? That's to say, who was the composer and who was the writer of the lyric?
Rogers wrote the music and Hammerstein wrote the lyric.
No. Who can have a go at that? And any of the others? Mr. Cairns?
Is it Rogers and Hart?
No. So it's a matter of firming some of these names, isn't it? I wonder if the Mrs.'s can have a go, Mrs. Arnold or Mrs. Clough. No, they shake their heads. Alan J. Lerner wrote the lyrics, Frederick Lowe wrote the music, it was Brigadoon, and it was Gene Kelly singing there. Mrs. Clough, in Dickens's Dombey and Son, what's the Christian name of the son?
Paul.
You're right. What in painting is a siccative? S-I-C-C.
Something which is used as a glue. Something used as a gum.
It's not quite close enough, so I must open it to the others. Mr. Cairns?
A drying agent.
It's a drying agent, yes it is. I wonder whether glue wouldn't do for that, but it's not quite precise enough. It's now Mr. Cairns' turn. What is a mouflon? M-O-U-F-L-O-N.
Sounds rather like some French culinary implement.
No, it's not that. I wonder what they would do with it. Serve soup rather meanly at restaurants, yes. Mr. Kerr?
It's a sheep.
It is. It's a wild sheep. It inhabits the mountains of Sardinia and Corsica. Mrs. Arnold, who was Prime Minister when Queen Victoria came to the throne?
Melbourne.
You're right. What is the Wheatstone Bridge used to measure?
Grain.
No. Mr. Kerr?
Electrical resistance.
It is used to do just that. And that brings us swiftly to the end of the second round. 2 to Mrs. Arnold, 2 to Mrs. Clough, 7 to Mr. Cairns, 11 to Mr. Kerr. Now, as Mr. Kerr's go, an Edwardian play called The Voysey Inheritance was revived as a BBC Play of the Month earlier this year. Who wrote it?
Granville Barker.
He did. Who was the last of the legendary kings of ancient Rome?
Tarquin.
Right. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. Lucius Tarquinius failed to recover Rome, though aided in his attempt by an Etruscan king, as described by Macaulay in the Lays of Ancient Rome. Who was this king?
Lars Porsena.
Correct. Why is it generally believed that a hazelnut is called a filbert?
Because it is shaped like one.
No. Mrs. Arnold?
Is it a word meaning a twin because they come in pairs?
No. Nice thinking. No, afraid not, though. Can the others have a try, Mrs. Clough or Mr. Cairns? No, they won't. It's because it ripens around St. Philibert's Day. In mid-August, there is a St. Philibert. You may have doubted it, but there is. Mrs. Clough, one of the most famous international car races is held at Le Mans. In which department of France is Le Mans?
Anjou.
No. Mrs. Arnold?
Maine-et-Loire.
No. Mr. Kerr?
South Maritime.
No. Mr. Cairns, a nice department for you?
Seine-et-Oise.
No, it is Sarthe, S-A-R-T-H-E, in northwest France. Mr. Cairns, what proportion of the legislatures of American states have to ratify any amendment made by the government, central government, to the Constitution before it can be valid?
2/3?
No. Mrs. Arnold?
3/4.
Yes, 75%, you're right. Your turn again, Mrs. Arnold. What is a willy-willy, and where would you find it?
I think it's an Australian bird.
No. Yes, Mrs. Clough?
An Australian wind.
It is a tropical cyclone, but that's close enough, and it originates off the coast of northwest Australia. Cyclone or tornado, but yes, strong winds. And the score, 3 to Mrs. Arnold, 3 to Mrs. Clough, 7 to Mr. Cairns, 14 to Mr. Kerr. Upton Sinclair, the American writer, Mr. Kerr, wrote a book called The Jungle, and he said, I aimed it at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach. What was the subject of the book?
Teaching.
No. Mr. Cairns?
The meatpacking industry in Chicago.
It was. Mrs. Clough, what country has, from May this year, a new parliament called the Landsting?
South Africa.
No. Mrs. Arnold?
Greenland.
You're right, Mrs. Arnold. Now, Mr. Cairns, what are albacore, fireflies, redwings, and hornets?
They're types of boat.
Yeah, nicely done. A racing dinghy, actually, but boat will do, yes. That was nicely done. What flower is sometimes known as the corn rose?
Marigold?
No. Mrs. Arnold?
Poppy.
Yes, the poppy, and someone in the audience knew it too. Now it's Mrs. Arnold's go again. Which country has the international car registration letters R.A.?
Riyadh.
No. Mr. Kerr?
Rwanda.
No. Yes, Mr. Cairns?
Rhodesia?
No.
South Africa again.
No, it's the Argentine. And at the end of the round, the scores: 3 to Mrs. Clough, 5 to Mrs. Arnold, 9 to Mr. Cairns, 14 to Mr. Kerr. How many pieces are there in a set of dominoes, Mr. Kerr?
28.
Yes, you're right, 28. Who in the 17th century invented the first mathematical calculating machine?
Napier.
No. Mr. Cairns?
Leibniz?
No. The ladies? No, it's Pascal, Blaise Pascal, famous French mathematician, physicist, and philosopher. Mrs. Clough, this music was the first big hit of its genre, and the title might remind you of Canada. So think about what the title might be as the music is played. So it's simply what the title is, Mrs. Clough.
Maid of the Mountains.
Not Maid of the Mountains. Too well, it leaps about a bit for the Maid of the Mountains. Well, I don't know. Mr. Cairns.
Maple Leaf Rag?
Maple Leaf Rag by Scott Joplin. Yes. Mr. Cairns, what is the membrane called that completely encloses the heart? Time's up. And Mrs. Clough?
Pericardic membrane.
The pericardium, yes, indeed. Mrs. Arnold, in February this year, England had its first £1 million soccer transfer. Indeed, a moment of celebration. Trevor Francis was the name of the chap. From what club was he transferred, and to what club did he go?
Nottingham Forest to Liverpool.
No. Mr. Cairns?
Birmingham to Nottingham Forest?
Lovely, got it right. Nice time, Mr. Kerr. And so the scores: 4 to Mrs. Clough, 5 to Mrs. Arnold, 11 to Mr. Cairns, 15 to Mr. Kerr. And as Mr. Cairns seems to be catching up with Mr. Kerr, we come to the point of the programme where we have a couple of questions aimed broadside on at all 4 competitors. On this occasion, from Mrs. H. Field of Thorpe Bay in Essex. And the first of the 2 questions is this: what was the pseudonym of the writer Amandine Aurore, Lucie Dupin?
We think Colette.
No, it was George Sand. Second question from Mrs. Field: Friday, the 6th day of the week, was named after whom or what?
Well, the Norse goddess Freya.
Yes, you're right. You got half right. Mrs. Field got half right. That means Mrs. Field has won. If she lets us know, she gets a book token or a record token. Now it's Mr. Kerr's go. Sir Walter Scott lived through the reigns of 3 British kings. Who were they?
George III, George IV, and William IV.
Well done, sir, yes. How do you fang a pump?
By fixing the lever to the plunger.
No. Mrs. Clough?
Pouring water down.
You do, because... Perhaps you'd like to say, Mrs. Clough?
No, but it's obvious. If you want to get water up, you have to put some down to lubricate it.
No, it's just that interesting word, fang.
No, I can't tell you
No,
that.
well, it's apparently so that it is indeed to prime the pump, so you can get the water up. And fanging is to catch hold of the water, which seems a very odd word to use, but an interesting one. Mrs. Clough, the poet James Hogg was known by a name which derived from his origins. What was he called?
The Ettrick Shepherd.
Right. In classical mythology, what power did Apollo bestow on Cassandra, daughter of Priam, king of Troy?
Foreseeing the future.
Yes. What was the pnyx in ancient Athens? P-N-Y-X.
Was it where they tested the coinage?
No, I think that's something called the Picts, and I think it still goes on somewhere or other. Mrs. Arnold.
A sacred object carried in ceremonials to worship the goddess Athene.
No, it sounds just right for that, doesn't it? But it isn't. Mr. Cairns?
Was it public rostrum in the...
A public...
A public rostrum in the equivalent of the forum?
No, Mr. Kerr.
The meeting place of the Senate.
You that'll do. Yes, the place where the People's Assembly met. Which is, but I would have thought, well, no, apparently rostrum wouldn't do, because rostrums are often used for other sorts of things. Mr. Cairns, as whom was Armand Jean Duplessis better known?
No, it's lurking at the back of my mind somewhere, but I can't.
You can't? Mrs. Arnold?
Racine?
No. Mrs. Clough?
A guess. Is this the Admiral Dupuy of the French fighting in South India?
No, it isn't.
No.
Mr. Kerr, have a guess.
No idea.
No, it's Cardinal Richelieu. Yep. Mrs. Arnold, under an assumed name, Giuseppe Balsamo, was famous in 18th century Europe. Possibly influenced the course of history. What name did he operate under?
The Corsair?
No. Does any of the others know? Mrs. Clough?
Cagliari.
I don't think so, Mrs. Clough. Mr. Cairns?
I was going to say Dr. Mesmer of Mesmerism.
No. Mr. Kerr, do you have a go at it?
I was going to say Casanova.
No, you jolly nearly got it, Mrs. Clough, but I don't think you could be given it. It's Cagliostro.
Oh.
Yes, Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, Italian charlatan and all manner of other sorts of things. At the end of the round, the scores, 5 to Mrs. Arnold, 7 to Mrs. Clough, 11 to Mr. Cairns, 17 to Mr. Kerr. Mr. Kerr, in connection with international trade, what does GATT stand for?
General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
Right. The city in India, which is most sacred to the Hindus, is now called Varanasi in that language. What was its old name?
Benares.
Yes, Benares. If you wanted to go to the British Embassy in Paris, what address would you ask for? Apart from rapping with your umbrella saying, take me to the British Embassy, all one ought really to have to do.
Number 5, Champs-Élysées.
No, I wonder what you find there. Mrs. Arnold?
The Quai d'Orsay?
No. I think that's the French Foreign Office, I don't know. Just trying to show off. Mrs. Clough?
I know it's Josephine's old house. That's not much use.
No, you couldn't say, take me to Josephine's old house. They'd say, quoi donc, or something like that, you did.
Hotel Burney.
No, Mrs. Clough doesn't get it, does Mr. Cairns?
Avenue Foch.
No, good sound names, all of them. 35, Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. You wouldn't have to get the number, but Faubourg Saint-Honoré you would have to get. Mrs. Clough, picture by Velasquez in the Prado in Madrid is called the Lances, because a row of lances upright is very prominent in it. What is the picture called here?
The burial of Count Auguste.
No. Mr. Kerr?
The Surrender of Breda.
You're right, sir, yes. Mr. Cairns, pinochle is the American form of what card game? No? Anyone? Yes, Mr. Kerr?
Pontoon.
No, it's not. So I laugh when pontoon's mentioned. It's such a simple sort of game, and pinochle sounds exactly as simple. Mrs. Arnold?
Canasta?
No, not canasta. Think of a card game, Mrs. Clough.
Vante?
No, that's the same as pontoon, isn't it? Yes. Bézique. Pinochle is the same as bézique, although it sounds like a sandwich, doesn't it, when you think it? Mrs. Arnold, the cups that cheer but not inebriate has been adapted into a slightly comic description of tea. Who originally coined the phrase?
Joseph Rowntree?
No. He did would have more to do with chocolate, wouldn't it? Yes, Mrs. Clough.
I think it was Cooper.
It was indeed William Cooper. Well done. And let me tell you now what the scores are. 5 to Mrs. Arnold, 8 to Mrs. Clough, 11 to Mr. Cairns, 20 to Mr. Kerr. Mr. Kerr, what are Muharram, Rajab, Shawwal, and Safar?
Parts of Arabia.
No. Mr. Cairns?
Months in the Muslim calendar.
That's exactly what they are. Mrs. Clough, Who was the most successful of English jockeys between 1870 and 1886?
Fred Archer.
He was. Where was the imperial diet held in 1521 at which Martin Luther refused to retract his beliefs?
Worms.
Worms, right. Who wrote these lines and on what occasion? Not once or twice in our rough island story, the path of duty was the way to glory.
Sounds like Thomas Campbell.
It does, but it isn't. It does, you're right, but it isn't. It's got that rum-tum-tum about it. Mrs. Arnold?
Clough.
No, not Clough. Mr. Cairn?
Again, it sounds like Sir Henry Newbold.
It does. It's got a touch of him, yes, that's right. But, I mean, it's wrong, I'm afraid, but it's right. They're all interesting replies, is all I really mean. Did Mr. Kerr have a go at it? Pick a poet.
Alfred Austin.
No, you're all aiming rather under the target, which happens on this occasion to be Tennyson. But I think that those aren't the two best lines he ever wrote. In his ode on the death of the Duke of Wellington. Mr. Cairn, what is the name of the westernmost department of metropolitan France in western Brittany?
Ouessant.
No. Mrs. Arnold?
Finisterre.
Finisterre, you're right. Your turn again. The novels The Beautiful Years, Dandelion Days, The Dream of Fair Women, and The Pathway together form a tetralogy called The Flax of Dream. Who was the author?
Powys.
No. Mr. Cairn?
Henry Williamson.
He was. Good for you. And I'll tell you what the prevailing scores are. They are 6 to Mrs. Arnold, 10 to Mrs. Clough, 13 to Mr. Cairns, 20 to Mr. Kerr. What is the stage name, Mr. Kerr, of Richard Jenkins?
Richard Burton.
You're right. With what phenomena do you associate P waves, S waves, and L waves?
Quantum mechanics.
No. Mrs. Arnold?
Earthquakes.
Earthquakes is right. Mrs. Clough, besides the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, what other power is known to have exploded a nuclear device?
India.
Right. In the British Army, the rank of second lieutenant was introduced in the latter part of the last century. As what was the lowest commissioned rank in the infantry known before then?
Ensign.
Yes. The Anglican Bishop of Wales is also the Bishop of where?
St. Asaph.
No. Mrs. Arnold?
St. David.
No. Mr. Cairn?
Bath.
No. Mr. Kerr?
Llandaf.
No. Bangor. Mr. Cairn, speed and endurance test is one group of events included in 3-day horse trials. Can you name the other 2?
Show jumping and dressage.
That's right. Which former duchy is now partly in Denmark and partly in West Germany?
Schleswig-Holstein.
No. Can anyone do that? Mrs. Arnold?
Holstein.
No. Mr. Kerr?
Kiel.
No. Mrs. Clough, have a go. Can you?
Schleswig.
Yes, Schleswig. Yes, it has here in great bold letters. For me, it says, don't accept Schleswig-Holstein. Holstein was a separate duchy, but it was Schleswig. Denmark has the north and Germany the south. Mrs. Arnold, the biblical story of the flood is often equated with one described in a Sumerian epic, which takes its title from the hero's name. Same sort of thing happened. Who was he, that hero, in this epic?
Deucalion.
No. Mr. Kerr
Gilgamesh.
is right. Good for you. That brings us to the end of the round. And the scores, 7 to Mrs. Arnold, 13 to Mrs. Clough, 14 to Mr. Cairns, 22 to Mr. Kerr. And now, with everyone scoring very high marks, it seems to me we can come to our last round. Mr. Kerr, one of the rivers of South America reaches the sea in Venezuela. What is its name?
Maracaibo.
No. Mrs. Clough?
The Orinoco.
Right for you. Your turn again. What is the subject of the ballad that begins? It fell about the Lammas tide when husbands win their hay.
It's the wife of Usher's Well.
No? Mr. Cairns?
The Battle of Otterburn.
Chevy Chase, yes, Battle of Otterburn. Your turn, Mr. Cairns. What are Tamworths, Lincolnshire curly-coateds, and Poland chinos?
Species of pigeon.
No, it isn't. It isn't pigeons. Mrs. Clough.
Pigs.
It is pigs. Mrs. Arnold, what is the name of the titular Archbishop of Synada in Phrygia, who continues to celebrate the Tridentine Mass despite Vatican objections?
No, it's gone. I can't remember.
No? Mr. Kerr?
Archbishop Lefebvre.
Yes, you're right. And that does bring us to the end of the round, the end of the competition on this occasion. Final score, 7 to Mrs. Arnold, 15 to Mr. Cairns, 15 to Mrs. Clough, 23 to Mr. Kerr. So, since we still need 2 winners, and Mr. Kerr is certainly one of them with a score of 23, the decider is between Mrs. Clough and Mr. Cairns. We just have a sort of sudden death playoff in which I ask, I think, what is a fairly simple question, and it's whichever of the 2 clients, as it were, get the light on first. He or she gets to answer first, gets it right, that's it. If not, then the other man or the other woman has a chance to try it. Here we go. Very easy. What nationality was the playwright Strindberg? Mr. Cairns?
Swedish.
You're right. Yes. Yes, there you are. Mr. Cairns is the winner on that sudden death playoff. Mrs. Clough played very well and very hard because she was pulling up all the time. I dare say if it had gone on a bit longer, who knows, the ending might have been different. But it's Mr. Kerr and Mr. Cairns. They're our winners. They come forward in the semi-final. And next week we have Wales and Northern Ireland in the last of our second round heats. Until then, I bid you goodbye.